I'm a 911 dispatcher. We just solved a months-old cold case because I broke one of the rules of our office. Desperation has a way of narrowing your focus until only the most immediate needs remain. 6 months ago, the stack of unpaid bills on our kitchen table was growing higher with every passing week. Being newly married is supposed to be a time of excitement, but for us, it was defined by a constant panic. The rent on our small apartment was due, the groceries were getting more expensive, and my wife was pregnant with our first child, so we needed a miracle, or at least a job that paid enough to keep us afloat. Sitting across from my wife one evening, watching her meticulously budget our last $50, made the decision for me. I applied for every municipal job available in our county, so when the acceptance letter arrived from the Emergency Communications Division, it felt like a lifeline. The starting pay for a dispatch operator was higher than anything I had ever earned, complete with dental insurance and a pension plan. It was exactly what we needed to secure our future. The training program lasted for 3 weeks. It was a rigorous process designed to weed out anyone who panicked under pressure. We learned the software and practiced active listening. The instructors constantly drilled us on maintaining an emotional distance from the callers. You are a router, so don't think of yourself as savior, the shift supervisor told us on our first day. Get the address, the details, and send the units. Do not let the callers drag you into their panic. The call center was located in the basement of the municipal building. It was a vast, windowless room filled with rows of identical cubicles, each equipped with 3 computer monitors and a multi-line telephone console. The air was always cool, and the only sounds were the soft clicking of keyboards and the low, murmuring voices of operators talking to people on their worst days. On my 3rd week of solo shifts, the call came in. It was a Tuesday, around 3 o'clock in the morning. The room was mostly quiet, the night shift lull having settled over the dispatchers. My headset beeped, indicating an incoming line. 911. What is the address of your emergency? A child's voice came through the receiver. It was a girl, whispering so softly I had to press my hand against my free ear to hear her. Please help me, she whispered. I am in the basement. It is very cold. Sweetie, I need you to tell me where you are, I said, typing a command to trace the billing address of the line. What is your house number? My dad did something awful to Mommy, the girl said. Her voice trembled, but she did not cry. She is lying on the kitchen floor and she won't wake up. He told me to go to the basement, and then he locked the door from the outside. I am scared. The address popped up on my center screen. It was a residence located in an older subdivision on the edge of the county. I immediately began routing the call to the sheriff's department. Before I could hit the dispatch key, a hand dropped onto my shoulder. Looking up, I saw my shift supervisor standing behind my chair. He was a veteran dispatcher who had spent 20 years in the basement, and he was staring at my screen with a frown. Cancel the dispatch, the supervisor said. His voice was flat. What? I stared at him, my headset still filled with the sound of the girl's quiet breathing. She says her mother is unresponsive and her father locked her in the basement. I know what she said, the supervisor replied, reaching over my shoulder to click the override button on my keyboard. He routed the call to a holding queue instead of the active deputy screen. But you are not sending anyone to that address. Why not? The senior operator sitting in the cubicle next to mine turned around in his chair. He had a look of tired pity on his face. Because that house has been empty for 5 months, he said. The family who lived there left in the middle of the night back in winter. Nobody knows where they went. They just vanished. Then who is on the phone? I asked, looking back at the glowing line on my console. We don't know, the supervisor said, pulling a rolling chair over to my cubicle. But it is a recurring issue. We get that exact call at least once a week. The sheriff's department went out there the first 3 times. They searched the house, the yard, and the outbuildings. They even checked the crawl spaces. The place is completely abandoned. There is no one there. Is it a prank? I asked. the girl's soft whispers still playing in my ear. Most likely, the supervisor said, standing up. Some kid with an old burner phone that still connects to emergency services. Or a neighbor playing a sick joke. Either way, it is a waste of county resources. The sheriff told us to stop routing the calls. If that address pops up, log it as a non-emergency glitch and move on to the next line. But she sounds so real, I murmured. They always do, the senior dispatcher next to me said. You get used to it. Just hang up the phone. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the disconnect key. Through the headset, I could hear the faint sound of a pipe dripping in the background of the call. It sounded incredibly close, as if the water was hitting a concrete floor right next to the microphone. Are you still there? The girl whispered. I hear something on the stairs. I swallowed hard and pressed the disconnect button. The screen went black, and the line cleared. That night, I went home to our quiet apartment. My wife was already asleep, her hand resting over her slightly swollen stomach. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, the sound of the dripping pipe echoing in my head. I tried to convince myself the supervisor was right. It was a prank, it had to be. But the calls did not stop. The next night, the same address flashed green on my monitor. I picked it up, hoping to hear silence or the giggling of teenagers. Please, the little girl whispered. It is so dark down here. I can hear him walking on the kitchen floor above me. He has a hammer. Sweetie, if this is a game, you need to stop, I said, keeping my voice low so the supervisor wouldn't hear me. The police have already been to that house. There is nobody there. I am under the stairs, she sobbed, her voice breaking for the first time. I am hiding behind the wood. Please tell them to hurry. I logged the call as a line glitch, just as the supervisor had ordered, and hung up. But the guilt began to eat at me. It felt like a weight in my chest. Every night for the next 2 weeks, the line would ring, and every night the same little girl would beg for help. The consistency of her voice and the terror in her tone with the subtle background noises of the dripping pipe were too perfect to be a prank. On my day off, the curiosity became too much to bear. Without telling my wife, I got into my car and drove out to the residential district. The subdivision was old, built in the late 1970s, with large lots and mature trees. Many of the houses were well maintained, but as I drove deeper into the cul-de-sac, the properties became neglected. I found the address. The house was a split-level ranch with faded gray siding. The yard was overgrown with tall weeds, and the driveway was cracked, with grass growing through the seams. A yellowed real estate sign sat tilted in the front lawn. The contact number faded from the sun. I parked on the street and walked up the concrete steps. The front door was locked, but the window next to it was dirty and bare. I pressed my face against the glass, shielding my eyes from the glare. The interior of the house was completely empty. I could see through the living room to the kitchen. There were no chairs, no tables, and no signs of life. The drywall was bare, and the linoleum on the kitchen floor was dusty. I walked around to the backyard. The grass was waist-high. I reached the sliding glass door at the back of the house and pulled on the handle. It was locked, but the lock was old and loose, so I gave it a hard jerk, and the latch slipped. The door slid open with a screech. Stepping inside, the air was cold and smelled of dust. My footsteps echoed loudly on the floorboards as I walked into the kitchen. I looked down at the linoleum. There were no bloodstains. There was nothing but a thin layer of grime. Near the pantry, a wooden door stood slightly ajar. I pushed it open, revealing a flight of dark wooden stairs leading down into the basement. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, turned on the flashlight, and began to descend. The basement was unfinished. The walls were made of rough concrete blocks, and the floor was poured concrete. In the corner, a water heater sat disconnected, its copper pipes severed. A slow drip of condensation was falling from an overhead pipe, hitting the concrete floor with a steady sound. Drip, drip, drip. It was the exact sound I had heard through the headset. I shined my flashlight around the room, then walked over to the wooden stairs, looking underneath them. There was nothing there but a few discarded paint cans and a layer of spider webs. I searched every corner of that basement. I knocked on the concrete walls, looking for hollow spaces, but the blocks were solid. The house was empty, and the supervisor had been right. I left the property through the sliding door, locking it behind me, and drove home. I felt a sense of relief, but also a deep embarrassment. I had let a prank caller get under my skin so much that I had broken into an abandoned house, so I promised myself I would stop answering the calls. But the next night at work, the green light flashed again. I stared at the screen, and the incoming address was the gray split-level house. "Do not pick it up," the dispatcher next to me said, noticing my hesitation. "Just let it route to the automated queue." I reached out and pressed the button anyway. I had to know. 911, I said. There was no sound of a little girl whispering. There was no dripping pipe. Instead, the line was completely silent for several seconds. "Why do you keep answering?" a voice asked. It was a woman's voice. She sounded so tired. "Who is this?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "Is this the mother?" "You keep picking up the phone," the woman said, ignoring my question. "The others stopped answering months ago. Why do you keep listening to her?" I leaned forward, pressing the headset closer to my ear. "Because she is scared," I said softly, making sure my supervisor was out of earshot. "Even if it is a prank or a glitch, she sounds like she needs comfort." I thought, maybe if I answer, it gives her some peace. "Who is this?" The line was quiet for a moment. I could hear the faint sound of wind blowing through a window on the other end. "If you want to comfort her," the woman said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "you need to go back to the house." "I was there," I said. "I searched the basement. There is nothing there." "You did not look closely enough," the woman said. "In the basement, behind the stairs, there is a wooden partition wall. It looks like part of the foundation framing. On the third vertical stud from the left, there is a rusted steel nail driven into the wood near the floor. Pull the nail." "What is behind the wall?" I asked, my hands turning cold. "She is waiting for you," the woman said. Then the line went dead. I sat at my desk, my mind racing. I could not focus on the rest of my shift. Every call I took after that was a blur of addresses and emergency codes. All I could think about was the third vertical stud from the left. When my shift ended at 6 in the morning, I did not go home. I drove straight back to that house. The morning sun was just beginning to rise over the trees, casting long shadows across the empty streets. The neighborhood was completely silent. I parked my car down the street from the house, walked up the driveway, and slipped through the backyard. The sliding glass door opened easily, just as it had before. Stepping into the kitchen, the stale smell of the house felt even more oppressive than before. I walked directly to the basement door, opened it, and descended the wooden stairs. I turned on my phone flashlight, the bright beam cutting through the gloom. I walked behind the wooden stairs. The area was cramped, filled with old paint cans and dust. The back wall of the staircase was framed with cheap pine studs, holding up a sheet of plywood that separated the understairs storage from the rest of the concrete basement. I began to count the vertical studs from the left. 1, 2, 3. I shined the light down near the concrete floor. Resting in the wood, just 2 inches above the concrete, was a large, rusted steel nail. It was driven deep, but the head of the nail was still protruding slightly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small multi-tool I kept in my glove compartment. I opened the pliers, gripped the head of the rusted nail, and pulled. The nail was old, the metal grating against the dry wood of the stud. I had to twist the tool, applying all my strength, until the nail finally slipped free with a sharp crack. The moment the nail came out, the wooden partition wall shifted. The plywood sheet swung outward like a door. revealing a dark, narrow crawlspace hidden directly beneath the basement stairs. The stench that erupted from the opening was overwhelming. It was a suffocating, sweet odor of rot that made me immediately gag, dropping my phone onto the concrete. I covered my nose with my shirt, my eyes watering from the fumes. I picked up the phone as my hand shaking so badly the beam danced erratically across the opening and shined the light into the crawlspace. The space was small, barely 4 feet high and 6 feet deep. Lying on the dirt floor of the crawlspace were 2 shapes. They were wrapped in dirty blue plastic tarps, secured with heavy silver duct tape. The plastic had been torn in places by nesting rodents, revealing the dark, leathery remains of what lay inside. I moved the light to the smaller bundle. Protruding from a tear in the blue plastic was a small, skeletal hand. The fingers were tiny, the bone-white joints covered in dried gray tissue. Next to the hand lay a small, pink plastic toy phone, its battery compartment rusted shut from the damp earth. I backed away from the crawlspace, stumbling over the paint cans and collapsed onto the basement floor. I vomited onto the cold concrete, my chest heaving as the reality of what I had found washed over me. I scrambled up the wooden stairs, running out of the house into the cool morning air. I stood on the lawn, gasping for breath, then pulled out my phone. I dialed the direct line to the sheriff's office. The response was immediate. Within 15 minutes, the quiet cul-de-sac was filled with flashing red and blue lights. Deputies barricaded the driveway, and a forensic team in white suits descended into the basement. I sat on the bumper of a patrol car as the lead investigator walked over to me. He looked grim, his boots covered in dry basement dust. "You are the dispatcher who called this in, right?" the investigator asked, pulling out a notepad. "Yes," I said, my voice hoarse. "I found them in the crawlspace behind the stairs." The investigator sighed, looking back at the gray split-level house. "We searched this place 3 times when the family went missing back in the winter," he muttered, shaking his head. "We checked the basement, but we never found that partition. Whoever built that crawlspace knew exactly what they were doing. They framed it to look like part of the foundation." "Who was in there?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Based on the dental records we retrieved from the file, it is the mother and her 7-year-old daughter," the investigator said. "The cause of death appears to be blunt force trauma. It looks like they were killed upstairs in the kitchen, wrapped in those tarps, and hidden in the dirt before the house was abandoned." "And the father?" I asked, my hands tightening around the blanket. "The father is the primary suspect," the investigator said. "He cleared out their bank accounts, sold their car to a scrapyard under a fake name, and disappeared after the murders. We have had a federal warrant out for him for months as we suspected something when the family vanished, but the trail went completely cold. And we didn't even have a crime scene to prove they were dead until you found that room. How did you know to look there?" the investigator asked, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at me. "Did you have an inside information?" I stared at the ground. I could not tell him about the calls, or about that a dead woman had given me the instructions to find her own corpse and the remains of her child. "I was doing some research on abandoned properties," I lied, my voice steady. "I saw the house was on the county tax lien list, so I went inside to check the structural integrity of the basement, and I noticed the framing behind the stairs was uneven. That's why I pulled a loose nail, and the wall opened." The investigator stared at me for a long moment, evaluating my face. Eventually, he nodded and closed his notebook. "Well, whatever the reason, you did a good thing today. At least those families have some closure now. We can finally start hunting the husband with a homicide charge." I was allowed to go home after my statement was finalized. I walked into our apartment and pulled my wife into a tight hug. I held her for a long time, listening to the steady beat of her heart, feeling the warmth of her skin. I did not tell her the details of what I had found. I just told her I had helped the police resolve an old missing person case. I went back to work the next night. The atmosphere in the dispatch room was different. The news of the discovery had spread quickly, and the other operators were talking about the house in hushed whispers. The senior dispatcher next to me looked at me with a mixture of respect and confusion. "The sheriff's department is calling you a hero," he said. "They said you found the bodies we all missed." "I was just lucky," I said, putting on my headset. I looked down at my console. The green light on my screen was dark. The address did not flash. The calls had stopped. The silence of the line was a relief, but it also left a strange, hollow feeling in my chest. For weeks, that little girl's voice had been the only constant in my long night shifts. Now there was nothing but the steady, boring hum of routine emergencies. I worked the dispatch job for another 3 months. The pay was indeed good, allowing us to clear our debts and prepare for the arrival of our baby. We bought a crib, stocked up on diapers, and even put some money away into a savings account. The financial pressure that had almost crushed us was gone. But I never stopped thinking about the father. Every day, I checked the federal database and the sheriff's internal bulletins, looking for any updates on his status. He was still out there, somewhere in the country, living under a fake name, completely free. The thought of him walking the streets while his wife and daughter lay in that dark dirt crawl space made me sick. I kept my headset on every night, secretly hoping the line would ring, hoping the woman's voice would come back through the receiver and tell me where he was hiding. But the line remained dead. Until tonight. I am writing this post from my personal laptop in the dispatch break room. My shift ended an hour ago, but I cannot bring myself to walk out to my car. My hands are still shaking as I type these words. 30 minutes ago, while I was logging off my console, the auxiliary line on the supervisor's desk began to ring. The supervisor had already gone home for the night, leaving only a skeleton crew in the basement. I walked over to his desk, planning to route the call to the automated system. I picked up the receiver instead. "Emergency dispatch," I said. The line was completely silent for several seconds. Then, a familiar, flat voice came through the speaker. "They got him," the woman said. My breath caught in my throat. "Who?" "The father," she whispered. "He was working as a night watchman at a warehouse 3 counties over. The police just walked through the gates and put the cuffs on him. He is in the back of a cruiser right now." I sat down in the supervisor's chair, a massive wave of relief washing over me. "It is over," I breathed. "He is going to prison." "Yes," the woman said. "He is, but I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For answering," she said. "For listening to her when everyone else hung up. You gave her comfort when she was trapped in the dark." I felt a tear slip down my cheek. "She doesn't have to call anymore," I said. "No," the woman agreed. "She is finally asleep." The line clicked, and the dial tone returned. I am posting this here because I need to get it out of my head before I go home to my wife and our child. I need people to know that sometimes the voices on the other end of the line are not glitches or even pranks. Sometimes they are just waiting for someone to be caring enough to finally pick up the phone and listen. The father is in custody. The trial will begin in the fall. And for the first time in 6 months, I am going to go home and sleep without the sound of a dripping pipe echoing in my mind.